We are now considering anger in its vicious forms. Some of you might be thinking, oh, finally, we get to something that I am free of, that I don't have to worry about. Maybe some of you never really get angry. My wife is like this. I have almost never seen her angry, and it's not because she is really good at hiding it. Maybe you are like that. But do you get frustrated? Do you get disappointed in others or various events? Are you often annoyed? Those states are very close to anger, and in many cases are, as we shall see, no different in terms of their ability to ruin us. Now, anger in general is an internal response to a perceived injustice. So, anger in general, the way that I just characterized it, is not obviously problematic, not obviously vicious or tending towards viciousness. But anger as vicious is a disordered internal response to a perceived injustice. So when we're talking about anger, we're going to focus on anger in its vicious manifestations. So we're not talking about good anger, righteous anger, holy anger. A lot of times, persons, when they get to the vice of anger, have a different reaction to it than some of the other vices that we've discussed. And I really think a lot of this is simply because of the name, the term. For the other vices, we have a term that clearly picks out the badness, the viciousness, the destructiveness of the habit. Here, we use the same term to refer to a general form that is not bad, that can be totally fine and even wonderful. And we use that exact same term to refer to the disordered, the perverted, distorted state. So don't get hung up on terms. Don't get hung up on the name that we're using. So we're going to focus on anger as vicious. Okay, that's our focus. So that is a disordered internal response to a perceived injustice. Where is the disorder then? Well, the disorder can be located in two different places. Your anger can be disordered in terms of the response. Maybe the response is twisted, too extreme, too long, too intense. Maybe you're too quick to anger. So that would be a disorder in the response to the perceived injustice. But the disorder can also be located in the perception itself. So maybe you think you have witnessed or experienced an injustice and you haven't. So it's a false or illusory perception. Oftentimes, vicious anger is a disorder of both sorts. A disorder in the response and a disorder in the perception. Now let's just think about this for just a moment. It seems to me this way of thinking about anger, this analysis, theory of anger, is quite profound. When I look back at all of the times that I've been angry, it does seem to me that it's accurate to describe my anger as a response to what I take to be an injustice. I experience something that seems to me to be unfair, oftentimes unfair to me, and my anger rises up. So this idea, this account, analysis of anger itself, and I'm just talking about anger in general here, not anger as a disordered response. I'm talking about just the general analysis of anger as this emotional state that we often enter into, that we often experience, and seeing it as a response to what we take to be an injustice occurring, either to us or to others. That does seem to get my anger right. Now notice this. Anger is a type of emotion, right? It's an emotional state. What this suggests then is that emotions have correctness conditions. That's my phrase, correctness conditions. That is, our emotional response to various event situations can be correct or they can be incorrect. And so sometimes I think we think of emotions as being outside the realm of evaluation, right? That, look, I experience these emotions. There's nothing that I can do about them. I'm sort of a passive recipient of them, and you can't really criticize my emotional responses. But notice this way of analyzing anger, and as I've said, it sure seems to me to be pretty profound and true. This suggests that that's just not right. Our emotions are criticizable. They're evaluatable. You can have a correct emotional response to a situation. In that case, you're doing well. And you can have an incorrect, a faulty emotional response to a situation. And in that case, obviously something is off and needs to be fixed. And so anger as vicious will always be like that latter sort. It fails in some way. So it's an emotional state that we enter into that fails when it's vicious. Okay, so anger is a response. It's this internal response to a perceived injustice. And so the vice is either going to be a disordered response to a real injustice. So you do perceive an injustice, but your response is somehow off. Or it can be a disordered response to what you take to be an injustice, but it's not one. So in this case, we got two problems. Your response is off. It's too intense. It's too long. And your perception is off. There was no real injustice. The example that I often think of for me is, and some of you might have experienced this, I've bumped my head on the trunk of our car too many times to count now. And when I bump my head on the trunk of the car, it does not feel good. It hurts. And so I often respond in anger. My fist clenches. It drives me nuts. My jaws clench, right? The pain, I perceive something's wrong. Something's off. There's almost I'm taking this situation as one of unfairness or an injustice has occurred. And my response is anger. And so in these sorts of cases, my response is very often disordered, way too intense. I want to punch the car. I blame the car for committing an injustice against me. Do you hear how stupid that sounds? And notice, so my response is way too intense, but also my perception is faulty. Cars can't commit injustices. So I have a disordered response to what I perceive to be an injustice, but there is none. So these types of cases are faulty, disordered in two ways, the response as well as the perception. Or, of course, we can have a response to a perceived but not real injustice. So in this case, maybe the response would have been perfectly fine if the injustice had been actual. right? So you might think of it like this. Suppose you're moving in a crowd. You're walking down a pathway, a sidewalk in the mall. Maybe it's fairly busy, and someone bumps you fairly hard. And in some of these types of cases, you might respond with a little bit of anger, right? A little bit of frustration, annoyance. You look around looking for the perpetrator. And maybe the person that you see, they saw what happened to you. Maybe they were the one that the person who bumped into you. And you can tell by the look on their face it was totally accidental. And so in that case, maybe your response, maybe you weren't too angry, you weren't incensed, you weren't raging. You're just a little annoyed, a little frustrated. And so you might think that in that case, the response would have been totally justified. It would have been a totally fine response if there really were an injustice. If someone really had purposely bumped into you. But in this case, no one did. And so maybe your perception for a moment was slightly off. So our anger can go wrong in numerous ways. It goes wrong then when the object of our anger is either not real or when it is directed at a real object in the wrong way. It's either excessive or deficient. Now, this is an important point here too. The types of anger that we're going to focus on are really going to always be, are going to be for the most part as we proceed, excessive forms of anger. Where we're going to focus primarily on the disordered response and not the disordered perception. And the disorder that we're going to highlight is an excessive disorder where the anger really is going beyond the perceived injustice. This is where the vice of anger shows up the most and is really the most destructive. But there is another vicious form of anger that I do want to mention, even though I'm not going to really say much about it beyond here. And it's this. It's persons who never experience any anger, any annoyance, any frustration, any of those sorts of, you might say, negative emotions. And for persons like this, the anger is problematic, not because it's too much, obviously, but because it's not enough. It's deficient in some ways. And so the worry here would be that the person isn't accurately perceiving the world. They're not noticing injustices. They're blind to injustice. And sometimes that is a problem. Right? You can think of many sorts of examples of this throughout history. Think of Nazi Germany, where maybe persons did have a sense, an awareness. Maybe they knew all sorts of things going on in their community, in their country, that were very unjust, and they just went about their business. They didn't respond in any way. In those cases, obviously the problem isn't that they have excessive anger, it's they don't have any. There's no anger. You might think of another case. Suppose someone that you know, they're regularly angry, they're always sort of flying off the handle, and it's always at little things. And then you might, maybe you're sitting around the table and you're chatting about some of the injustices in the world. You're talking about various real life problems that impact people in unbelievably negative, horrific ways, and the person doesn't have a response at all. They flip out if milk is spilled, and yet there's no response whatsoever when you tell them about persons being tortured, Christians being persecuted, sex slavery happening, human trafficking occurring all over the world. The person doesn't seem to care. So these would be cases maybe where there's just there's not enough anger. There should be some anger here, and there's none. Those are problematic too. We're not going to focus on those anymore. One of the dangers with anger is that we place ourselves at the center, and thus we wind up making demands on others and on the world that are simply not reasonable. Demands that would only make sense if we were God. We demand respect that is either not due to us at all by the person that we're involved in a relationship with, or it's not due to us at the level that we demand it. In this way, think about it like this. In this way, anger is linked with love. What do you get angry about most often? What annoys you regularly? I bet you will find a pattern here. What makes us angry or annoyed is a good indicator of our loves. If I am regularly annoyed or angry at being interrupted when I speak, maybe I love the sound of my voice or my own thoughts and ideas. If I'm regularly upset at delays in my work or eating or watching television, maybe I love my time or food or entertainment a bit too much. Our anger patterns reveal our loves in really clear ways if we attend to them. So, anger is intimately linked to perceptions of justice or injustice, and anger can reveal what we care about the most. But what is justice? In the most basic sense, and here I'm going to give you the quick and dirty version. Justice demands that equals be treated equally and that unequals be treated unequally. That last part is important and we need to be careful. Justice demands that equals be treated equally and that unequals be treated unequally. Let me give you some examples of that last clause. Suppose your 5-year-old demands to drive. Maybe they see your 16-year-old getting their driver's license and they think that they should be able to as well. In this case, the inequality between your 5-year-old and your 16-year-old is such that if you gave your 5-year-old the keys to the car, you'd be committing an injustice. You're not recognizing the radical difference between the 5-year-old and the 16-year-old. Think about it like this: underdeveloped talents. Someone who simply just hasn't developed their gifts yet to start on the basketball team or the baseball team or do a particular task, demanding to be treated the exact same way as those who have developed their gifts, if you were to give them that equal treatment, an injustice might be occurring here. Different personalities. Think about it like this. I love my kids equally. I love them equally as my children, but I better treat them differently when it's appropriate. They're different personalities, different gifts, different attitudes, different weaknesses and strengths. And so if I don't recognize that and treat them as though they are the exact same person, injustices occur all over. So justice requires that we properly recognize equality and inequality and treat them both as such.